All right. Thank you, everybody who put this terrific program together. My name is John Grove. I'm going to be speaking, and hopefully he's just setting the table for a conversation about the relationship between intellectual conservatism and partisan movement conservatism in America. In his 1993 essay, Popular Conservatism, published in The Politics of Prudence, Russell Kirk placed hope in a natural conservative instinct that he identified in most Americans, an unlearned and unrefined sort of conservative tendency, able to identify well enough some of the social ills around him, skeptical of fanciful narratives that were spun by cable TV pundits, also skeptical of the promises and projects conceived by politicians, and desirous of the freedom to educate his children, to worship God, to contribute to his community. Indeed, Kirk saw at the outset of the Clinton presidency both political parties at least paying some sort of lip service to this popular conservatism of the average American. The big question, he noted at the time, was how this basic instinct would be educated and directed in the years to come. He said, conservatism is not going to become unpopular in America, so the question before us is not whether it will be supplanted by a new liberalism, but rather if a high degree of intelligence and imagination may be infused these next few years into this popular conservative yearning. Some of us, having labored in that vineyard for 4 decades, pray that the harvest may be sweeter than the grapes of wrath. Those last sentences, viewed now from 30 years on, I think have a rather melancholy ring to them. Now, there has always been a distinction between what the description of this conference calls the intellectual conservative tradition and partisan movement conservatism. A conservative tradition on the one hand, is a conservative tradition of thought about how the human being relates to his social and political surroundings. And on the other is an organized political movement promoting an agenda understood to be in some way, shape, or form an outgrowth of that understanding. The relationship between these is naturally fraught, given that the conservative intellectual tradition has generally held that conservatism does not correspond to any particular political program. A conservative political movement, then, must always walk a very fine line. A group of partisans may share a conservative temperament and seek to influence policy and government outcomes, generally guided by their conservative prudence. But it would have to guard very carefully against ideologizing itself and turning its policy aims into ends in themselves, and thus losing the entire thread of intellectual conservatism. Both Kirk and Scruton recognize the tension between the deeper intellectual conservatism and the partisan advocacy that has used the name conservatism. Neither certainly shied away from a degree of advocacy, but both also recognize that a key to the conservative understanding of the world is that certain social and cultural realities are outside the control of politics and are far more essential to a healthy social order. Thus, neither hesitated to criticize their side of the political aisle when it threatened those deeper values. Kirk favorably cited Eliot on this very matter, who argued that there must be a distinction between those who detach themselves in the pursuit of truth and those who are devoted to political advocacy, even as there ought to be linkages and continuity that allows conservative ideas to have an effect in the world. He warns equally, this is Kirk quoting Eliot in a letter to Kirk, he warns equally against the political theorist becoming a doctrinaire who dominates the man of action, and against a tradition in which political philosophy is formulated or recodified to suit the requirements and to justify the conduct of a ruling clique. In America, I would argue, at least since the Reagan presidency, the incessant struggle to control the levers of the central Leviathan state, and particularly the executive branch, has dominated the imagination of movement conservatives, with the result that the latter of the two dangers Eliot warned of, the tail has wagged the dog. Conservatism has come to mean what the Republican Party standard bearers say it is, defined and redefined based on the political objectives of the moment and of the men. This has taken many iterations, from the neoconservative crusaders for liberal democracy to libertarian-inflected Ayn Rand reading conservatives to today's populist national conservatives. All of these, I believe, have ideologized some aspect of the prudential conservative approach to politics, and all, accordingly, have sold a bill of goods to America's popular conservatives that Kirk appealed to, by promising that there is a clear political or policy solution to the evident dangers that they perceive to their traditional way of life. Not least of all, this brand of conservatism has systematically captured the minds and attentions of young people who have an instinctive conservative impulse, directing them away from cultural endeavors and toward the inanities of talk radio, then cable news, and now social media influencers and podcasters. Not all podcasters are bad, by the way. It has turned these young people, I think, toward what Kirk called the politics of passionate unreason. Not only has movement conservatism distracted adherents from cultural and societal goods, it has also distorted those very goods by viewing culture only through a political lens. Klaus Rinn has noted this tendency for a long time, and in 1996, he described it in terms that continue to ring true today. In recent years, Rinn observed, individuals known as conservatives have taken a greater interest in the state of the culture. In part, this development may be a sign of an awakening to the importance of thought and imagination. At the same time, it confirms and gives new impetus to the ideologization of American conservatism, in that the interest in the culture is often heavily slanted by the old fascination with political power. Issues of cultural decline are discussed as if the key to reversing the trend lay in the hands of politicians and their intellectual allies. Much of the present conservative interest in the culture, again, this is still Rinn, is due to a growing awareness of the political impact and propaganda potential of the mind and the imagination. It has also become politically opportune to bemoan cultural sleaze. Many right-leaning activists today also loudly declare that culture counts, but engage with culture explicitly on the same terms as Marxist radicals who saw culture as a contrived and controllable phenomenon that serves the interest of this or that political and economic group. Accordingly, they seem not to have imbibed much of the traditional conservative understanding of culture, recognizing the limits of political action and the limits of one's own moralistic pretensions. There are likely many culprits as to why movement conservatism became untethered from the politics of prudence. But one of them, I would argue, is that the imperative to win national power, and especially the presidency today, systematically cuts against a politics that, in the words of Scruton, starts at home. Scruton argued that a healthy politics is one that grows out of the habits and ways of life of a settled political community. It is an outgrowth of a pre-political social commitment to one another and the patterns that allow a people to share a particular place. This commitment to a shared home generates skepticism of an enterprising politics that would aim to remake society wholesale or always distract it with collective projects. Rather, it allows for the possibility of what Oakeshott called a civil association, aiming at the maintenance of social order, the administration of justice, and the flourishing of non-governmental authorities that pursue human goods that politics cannot provide. As I've argued elsewhere, in America, this sort of politics rooted in a commitment to a shared home has never been possible directly at the national level. New Yorkers, Hoosiers, Arkansans, Michiganders, and Californians simply do not share a place in any meaningful sense. Commitment to America as a whole, then, must come in either one of two ways: as a community of communities, in which one's sympathy to the nation comes channeled through a commitment to locality, or, as it usually has, through ideological abstraction. Contemporary politics, in what is now a continent-sized presidential plebiscitary democracy with mass instantaneous communication, precisely calls out the latter, ideological abstraction. It demands a politics conducted in language and symbols that cut across and marginalize locality and place. The same political memes, used in the traditional sense of that word and in the internet sense of that word, the same political memes must be able to appeal to people who precisely do not share a place or a way of life that emerges from a place. The issues to be discussed, the passions to be aroused, and the money to be donated all must therefore point far away from home. The citizen of a small Midwestern town must be made to care far more about what is happening in the streets of California, New York, Washington, Tel Aviv, or Tehran than what is in his backyard. And when political contestation does occur in his home, in his backyard, it will be undertaken in the language and the mindset of national ideological partisans rather than being worked out by the deliberation among neighbors. Insofar as movement conservatism has followed the incentives of this mass politics, incessantly focused on winning national elections, It has taken the popular instinct that Kirk identified and channeled it in the direction of personal grievance and collective power. And in doing so, it has cultivated among many conservatives the same kind of moral servility that Kenneth Minogue so astutely diagnosed among the modern liberal, who has channeled his moral instincts into political causes and away from responsibility and personal virtue. Many conservatives have become untethered, I think, from movement conservatives have become untethered from the insights of intellectual conservatives. Rather than struggle against this reality, I think it may be time to consider embracing the freedom that comes with it, declaring as much independence as possible from whatever happens to be going by the name conservative in Washington, D.C. In universities, classical schools, institutions devoted to learning and research, or in philanthropic activity, may be time for a retrenchment, articulating, Kirkian and Scrutonian truths that are a challenge to and an indictment of all influential currents of today's mass politics, just as much as it was when it was developed and formulated in the 1950s. Such conservatives are not powerless, but their work at this moment may likely consist in sowing seeds, the harvest of which no one here will reap. A few ways that this approach may manifest itself. First, the traditional and intellectual conservative could direct more attention to people's homes, to the place where we are. The dollars of philanthropic organizations could be dedicated more to Middle America, building strong towns and communities rather than being funneled inevitably to DC endeavors. Second and relatedly, intellectual conservatives ought to emphasize the reality that the highest endeavors of human beings and the greatest ambitions of the human soul do not depend on big picture political outcomes. Fighting against that servile attitude that I mentioned that holds that the only good we can do in life is to give ourselves over to a cause. As Scruton observed, the choice lies before us as it is lain before every human being in history to live well or badly, to be virtuous or vicious, to love or to hate. And this is an individual choice which depends on cultural conditions obliquely and which no other person can make in our stead. Third, organizations ostensibly devoted to educating for liberty, order, or responsibility must decide whether they seek to cultivate a deeper understanding of the world or if they seek to have temporary influence. Do conservative universities distinguish themselves by high standards and intellectual independence or by being partisan canvassers and DC influence peddlers? Do we invite to our campuses great writers and thinkers and artists, or popular influencers who check the intellectual diversity box more by being provocative than by being profound? Fourth, when it does come to politics, we ought to take our cue from another great traditional conservative, Robert Nisbet, and prize as among the most important political goals the preservation or recovery of the functional autonomy of sources of authority outside the state, recognizing that with autonomy from politics comes a duty to devote an institution to its distinctive tasks and activities. We must fight for the autonomy and the duties of churches to minister to souls rather than preach quasi-political moralism, the autonomy and duties of private schools to put our children into conversation with the great tradition of humane letters, the autonomy and duty of universities to pursue higher learning not aimed at influence but truth, cultivating what Scruton once called the virtue of irrelevance. Involved in this last point, we ought also to cultivate a relentlessly skeptical attitude toward central political plans to steel the minds of young conservatives against the seductive notion that as long as we are in charge, as long as the program tells us what we want to hear, then all the stuff about constitutionalism, limits, freedom, civil society, and human fallibility just don't count anymore. And on this point, no greater book, I think, is of relevance than Scruton's fantastic book, The Uses of Pessimism, which recounts the fallacies that all people are prone to, especially in positions of political power. For some time, of course, movement conservatism preached about these things, but they have all proved to be key stress tests that have largely been failed. To decline to expand the power of the state, to devolve serious authority to localities, to promote the freedom of civil society, even when it means giving up an opportunity to exert one's own power, to rile up supporters or to win more votes. these have proved to be too difficult a test for movement conservatives, both today and in the past. To the partisan activist, of course, all this sounds like suicide, though I am not advocating that conservatives decline to vote for candidates worthy of it or stop opining about contemporary politics, only that they renounce an instinctive and automatic loyalty to the movement as it exists in D.C. To this claim of futility, to the resistance of the dominance of Washington, D.C. Politics, I can only point to Kirk's comment from 1956, also in relation to a commitment to decentralization and locality. There, he says, conservatives must not be afraid of the public's ridicule for the public's sake. Conservatives in our time must be prepared for the role of Don Quixote. Thank you.